Yeah, so I want to have a little talk about why I like using Tailwind CSS currently. It doesn't mean it's the best solution for styling your applications, but it's something that I've been using because mainly I've been using the T3 stack and it's kind of included along the way. But I spent a lot of time building out UIs using like CSS and Sass. And lately on the side projects, I've been using Tailwind CSS, especially for this build order manager tool I've been working on. Everything here is styled with Tailwind CSS. And if you're a beginner, you might not really understand like what are the benefits of Tailwind and what are the trade-offs, right? Every tool that you have to pick, it's all going to have a trade-off. It's going to have a pro and a con. And it's good to understand like what are the pros, what are the cons. So let's talk about the pros and cons of normal CSS. First of all, the pros are it's built directly into the browser. There's no additional things you have to install. Like it's just there. And CSS is getting more flexible and powerful. Like you have variables, you have like different things that are coming out with CSS that allow you to style your page differently and more efficiently. There's media queries built into CSS that you can just learn and use to make your application responsive. So everything you'd ever need to style your page basically exists in CSS. And some other pros to just naming stuff with CSS is that you can do stuff like this. You can just add a single word, a single thing that describes what you need to style, and your styles are going to be completely abstracted away from your HTML, right? So I could just add a link here, and that'll basically make this thing be styled a certain way. And I really like that about just CSS and Sass and how like we basically define classes and you can have like selectors and stuff like that. I really like that, and sometimes I really miss that about CSS when I'm working with Tailwind. Now, some cons to CSS, if you don't actually follow a predefined structure, such as BEM, I believe there's other ones as well that I can't name off the top of my head. If you don't follow some structure and you don't have like scoped styles, you can run into a lot of issues where as you start installing third-party like CSS libraries, you'll have styles that override other styles, right? And that's important because CSS is cascading style sheets. So that depending on the ordering that you install these libraries, like if you were to install Bootstrap first and then style like a .container, that could completely change the layout of your page versus if you set up your styles first and then you import Bootstrap. Because I think Bootstrap does have a class called container. And if in your code you have something called container, you're going to have some type of overlap. And it's kind of hard to debug your styling to not know like what is applying styles where. Secondly, with just using CSS, there's other things that you can do that are, bad practice. Like if you add important somewhere, like it's going to be very hard to debug why something is doing the thing it does. Or if for some reason you have like a custom component that has like an H3 in it, but then somewhere in your 20 CSS files, someone decided to put like padding bottom of 20, and now you're like looking at your code and like, I don't know why this has padding to it, right? So then you have to go and you have to inspect and figure out, okay, why does this thing have padding? Where's the padding coming from? You have to scroll through all this. So those are some cons to CSS. And again, those are just like, once you become more disciplined with writing vanilla CSS, if that's even a term, like those aren't really that big of issues. But for a beginner, you can run into a lot of issues if you don't properly scope your styles and make stuff follow a certain pattern. So again, this is like talk about Tailwind CSS and why do I like using Tailwind CSS and what are the things that I don't like about using Tailwind CSS. The first thing you'll notice when you start touching Tailwind is like you have all of these styles that are inline and they kind of start going off the page, especially if you have more and more things that you want to apply to a div. Like this thing just gets super, super long and it's kind of hard to read. And I know there's ways to like indent this, but then you're going to have like 50 lines just to kind of style a single component. So it's like a trade-off. It's like all your styles are inline now, so it makes it a little bit harder to understand like what the styling are. You have to kind of parse through these. Maybe there's a way to like sort these to make them all alphabetical. And then some of these things say like dark. So like you have to have that mental model in your head that like, okay, well, even though I see text black here, there might be 50 lines down the road, there might be a dark colon text, something that changes what this text is. So there's just like that overhead, which I'm not sure if I'm a fan of this, honestly. I do miss that all of my styles are like on different lines when I'm dealing with CSS or Sass style sheets. But you kind of get used to it. It's like I don't know, it's just weird. So another reason I kind of like having inline classes with Tailwind is that you can kind of right off the bat know where styling is going to come from. There's no like guessing. There's no like doing some investigation to figure out how does this thing look the way it does. Basically, you can just look at your React component. So I can go to my finds build page here, which I guess I could just do this, go find the find builds page, and then I can try to find that label in the unordered list. And basically, the way Tailwind CSS is written, like all the styles are directly on the components. So if I look at this, I'm like, well, I wonder why this thing has a blue background for all the ULs. I know that there's probably one place I need to look, and that is on this find build page. I need to find the ULs, right? So let's look at the labels here, or the divs here, and let's go to them. And let's try to figure out, how does the background of this thing, why is it the way it is? So if I were to go into the code where this component is, like, it's pretty easy to know, okay, well, this thing is probably being styled from something here, right? These are the places I have to look. I don't have to guess too hard. And if I just change one of these, let's just make this like red, is that where the styling is? Yes, it's applied right there. Okay, so I like that about that. So that's one thing I really like about having the styles be super coupled to the HTML. Like, some people want to argue that's a really bad thing. And this whole, it kind of is a bad thing, because now my entire application is 100% coupled to Tailwind CSS. And then 5 years down the road, if I decide I don't want to use Tailwind, good luck getting off of Tailwind, because now everything is coupled to all of these custom Tailwind classes. And if you want to get off of Tailwind, you basically have to write your own classes basically to migrate off that. But you don't have to over-engineer for every potential what ifs. So I don't know if that's really a good argument. So another thing I kind of really like about Tailwind is that if you look around on these Tailwind component libraries, if you find something that you want to use in your own application, usually it's pretty straightforward to just copy and paste the code directly into your app. You don't have to worry about doing like an npm install to get the components that you want, or get to the headers or the hero banners or whatever. Usually what you can do is just go to the component library, go ahead and go to the code, and just copy the code, right? So go ahead and copy the code. I'll go to components. I'll just say hero tsx, and I'll just go ahead and create one here and paste that in. Now, usually there's a little bit of refactoring that you have to do to make it like work with JSX. If you're using React, or I don't know, maybe you have to change some stuff with Vue or Svelte. But usually you can paste it in and you'll get a couple of errors depending on what the errors are. So let's just delete some of these comments. Some of these tags don't have closing in tags. So let's just go ahead and add those real quick so we don't get these errors. And everything's saved. I think it's good. All right, so let's just try adding this. If I add like a hero here, let's see if this thing actually works. There you have it. So the exact same component with a little bit of work was able to be rendered on my page. And now I have the ability to basically customize it however I want. I can come in here, I can change stuff around, I can make it the way I want it to be. I can delete links if I want to. There's no third-party library you have to install. There's no CSS you have to like import and get set up. There's no like framework that you have to use like Material UI, where when you want to customize it, you start running into edge cases that make it a little bit difficult to customize. So I do like that about Tailwind. It doesn't really abstract you too far away from, you know, the lower level CSS, and it kind of gives you the flexibility to style and manage stuff yourself. But some cons about this is, as a beginner, I think it leads you down a path of potentially copy and pasting code all throughout your code base. And you need to slow down and realize that you need to like sometimes dry stuff up. You need to create abstract components so that you don't have like the same styles copied everywhere. A good example of this is if I were to go and find like a button here. Let's just go to Flowbyte, type in button. And we got some buttons here, right? So these look pretty good. I can copy one. Now, an issue I would potentially see with a beginner using Tailwind is they would just go ahead and copy this button directly in to their app, right? So now they got like a button that says default. Now, this is problematic because if you take this button and you just start copying it all throughout your code base, which I think Tailwind kind of enables you to do a lot easier than something like if I was doing just CSS and this thing has the class name of button, right? This stuff copied all through your code base is going to be an issue if your designer or someone decides that you don't want rounded buttons anymore. If someone comes to you and say, hey, like, I don't want you to round these buttons, well, now you have to go and find every single button that you added throughout your code base, and I have to find that style, and then I'm going to go ahead and like have to go and find rounded LG and make sure I delete that to make it square. So now you've kind of shot yourself in the foot because you've copied and pasted these tailwind components all through your code base. And again, this is a more of like an issue with the developer themselves, like not properly finding where code can be abstracted away and reusable. So I don't know if that's a real issue with Tailwind. I guess you could potentially do the same stuff with other type of styling approaches, but just keep that in mind. If you're someone who's doing that, like just copying and pasting components all through your code base, you probably want to actually abstract those away and make reusable components. Now, there's another thing about Tailwind that I think is pretty cool, but again, like, I don't know if people actually think you should do this. So there's a way to basically take classes in Tailwind and use the Tailwind helper utility, like atomic CSS classes, and apply them to class names. So like, for example, I had this link that I created. If I ever wanted to have a link, let's just find like a link. And I'm using that link to basically style this link here, right? So if I go to like the home page, I'll delete that and show you what I'm talking about. Let's just go to the home page here. I don't know why the top stuff's not working. So the home page, notice that the link is not styled anymore. It just looks ugly. I was styling that with a custom CSS class that was using the tailwind apply directive or whatever it's called to basically give this thing some underlying and some text. Now, people say that you probably shouldn't even do this. They argue that it's better to just have like a shared React component called like link, and that you could pass in different variants. I don't really know. There's not really a consensus, I don't believe. So you could run into issues like that where there's not really a good defined path forward, at least what I can tell, of how you should use different things in Tailwind. Overall, I don't think that's a big of an issue. One thing that I do like about Tailwind is that all of these CSS classes usually just correspond one-to-one with an underlying CSS property. Like for example, if I hover over item center, you'll see that that just corresponds to align item center, which is pretty cool. So like technically, as you're using Tailwind, you can hover over stuff and try to understand like, okay, this is how you can write a media query to basically, when the app is in dark mode, to change the background to a certain color. Okay, so it's kind of like nice to be able to hover over stuff and understand what these things are doing, especially if you're good at CSS. Like this stuff just can help you reinforce your CSS knowledge and stuff. There's also a lot of nice helper utilities for Tailwind. So like if I were to go back to my home page here, which I believe is this one. And let's say I wanted to have this application change on different views. Well, I believe there's certain directives on Tailwind where I can say like, okay, well, on a small screen, I want this text to be red. Okay, so it's very easy to just like change. Let me go ahead and just scale this thing down. And as you get to a certain point, I forgot to add the 400, but as you get to a certain point in your screen break size, notice that it changes from red to white. So like you have all these nice utility methods that you can apply. Like you've seen the dark one. So like dark colon, light colon. You also have like these cool little things you can add for when you hover over stuff. So I can say like hover, and I can also change the text to like blue, like this. Although there's no hover when I have this thing turned on, so let's just do that. So I really like that about Tailwind. It kind of makes stuff really, really quick to just like add some type of behavior to something. And then again, like make sure you abstract and dry up your code and don't just apply these things everywhere, because now your code's gonna become super unmaintainable. But if there's ever like a one-off instance where a designer needs you to do something in this very specific case, you could just add a style there. But overall, I mean, like if you're watching this video and you're expecting to like be enlightened by like, oh, you should use Tailwind for everything or you should use CSS for everything. Honestly, I think it just boils down to a personal preference. I haven't used this on a large scale project with a lot of people, so there could be a potential pitfalls that I don't know about. And I can't sit here and talk about those pitfalls unless I personally ran into them on a project. But we use Sass at work, so the only pitfalls I can tell you about Sass kind of go back to the other approach where like you can have styles that kind of overwrite other styles. But sometimes when I'm using Tailwind, I do just miss the ease of just like saying this is a container or this is like my page, and just have like a nice class that basically describes what this page does. Sometimes you can use BIM, sometimes you can use like inline styles, or sometimes you can use like scoped CSS. At this point, I think I'm just rambling. I do say that I do like Tailwind CSS, and I do think it's worth trying on a new project. But again, if you're familiar with CSS and you can easily style a page with CSS, I think it's also fine to just stick with CSS because I think it's going to achieve the same thing as Tailwind. So don't feel like you're losing out if you haven't learned anything about Tailwind. Anyway, have a good day. Happy coding. Be sure to join my Discord if you want to talk to me directly or just talk to other people and ask questions as you're trying to learn how to code. There's a lot of other people out there smarter than me with better opinions than me, so be sure to reach out to other people and try to find a community of other devs who can help you grow.